He slept with his eyes wide open. Always, when asked, the old trapper simply said, "On Sorrow Ridge, you learn not to blink." Elias Crane was a fur trapper and wilderness guide who operated across a stretch of mountain terrain in the northern Appalachian from roughly 1871 to 1896. He left behind no great invention, no political legacy, no fortune. What he left behind was a single leather-bound journal, a collection of hand-drawn maps, and a reputation among the men who worked the same territory that something had happened to him up in those mountains. Something that changed the way he moved through the world. Something he would only discuss in fragments, late at night, usually after enough whiskey that his caution had softened, but never enough that his hands stopped watching the doorways. His journal was donated to a small county historical archive in 1931 by his granddaughter. It sat in a box with surveying tools and a rusted bear trap for decades. Then in 2017, a researcher cataloging the collection photographed every page and uploaded it to a regional digitization project. It has been circulating in certain corners of the internet ever since. In forums and threads and private correspondence between people who look at old documents, the way other people look at constellations, searching for a pattern that explains something they already feel is true. What Crane wrote in that journal is the reason we're here today. Before we go into what he saw and what he believed it meant, we need to establish the context. Because you cannot understand what Elias Crane documented on Sorrow Ridge without understanding what he believed he was looking at. And what he believed he was looking at was not a ghost. It was not a creature. It was not a hallucination from a man who had spent too many winters alone in the dark. He believed he had found a remnant, a piece of something deliberately left behind by a civilization that was not supposed to have existed. Tartaria is a word that appears on European maps from the 13th century onward. In the standard academic account, it refers to a loosely defined region of Central Asia associated with Mongol and Turk peoples, a broad geographic designation that shrank as European graphic knowledge improved. By the 19th century, the name had largely disappeared from serious maps, absorbed into the new geography. That is the official story. There is another story. In that story, Tartaria was not merely a geographic label. It was the last visible trace of a cartographic acknowledgement of something far older. A global civilization with a reach that modern archaeology refuses to credit. A civilization that built at a scale the accepted timeline cannot comfortably explain. Massive stone structures, underground networks, architectural traditions that appear without clear origin in cultures separated by thousands of miles of ocean and mountain. The same vaded arches, the same hydraulic systems, the same foundational geometries in places that, according to the timeline, had no contact with each other. The people who study this are not all conspiracy theorists in the pejorative sense. Many are meticulous, drawing from documents simply not well known, sitting in archives exactly like the one where Elias Crane's journal spent 60 years in a box. What they argue is this: that there was a reset. At some point, probably within the last few centuries, something happened. The civilization that had covered large portions of the Earth's surface was erased, not metaphorically, physically. And then a new history was written on top of the ruins, which were either demolished, repurposed, or absorbed into the landscape slowly enough that most people stopped noticing them. Sorrow Ridge, according to Elias Crane, was one of the places where the ruins had not been entirely absorbed, and something in those ruins was still active. His first entry mentioning the ridge is dated the 14th of September, 1882. He had been working that territory for over a decade, and writes matter-of-factly in the clipped style of a man recording practical information that he has found what appears to be a worked stone foundation buried beneath the root systems of a stand of old-growth oak. He estimates the stones are cut to an unusually high precision. His language is careful. He does not say ancient. He says old in a way I cannot account for. The trees growing through and over the structure are, by his rough estimate, between 200 and 400 years old, which means the structure was already buried before those trees were saplings. He sketches the stones in the margin of the journal. Rectangular blocks of significant size fitted together without visible mortar, with a slight inward bevel on the outer face, consistent with techniques he has seen described in books about old-world architecture, but never personally encountered in any American construction. He notes it, marks its location, and moves on. This is important. He does not dramatize the discovery or spiral into speculation. He is a practical man recording a practical observation. The stone foundation is unusual. He will return when weather permits. He returns in October. What he finds when he comes back is that the site has changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm a casual observer. But Crane is not a casual observer. He knows how things look. And what he notices is that the stones he saw in September are now partially visible in a way they were not before. The root systems around them have shifted, pulled back almost, as though something beneath the surface has moved. He digs a small test trench along the eastern edge of the foundation. What he finds 3 feet down stops him cold, he writes. Beneath the coarse stone, there is a layer I do not have a name for. It is not bedrock. It is not filled earth. It appears to be a manufactured surface, almost glassy in consistency, dark gray in color, and perfectly level across the full width of my trench. I struck it with my pick, and it rang like iron, but did not chip. I tried to lever a section free and could not. He covers the trench. He leaves the site. He comes back 3 days later with a longer pry bar and a better lamp. The glassy surface is gone. The trench he dug is exactly as he left it. The disturbed soil is still disturbed. The tool marks on the stone foundation are still visible, but the surface that rang like iron is simply not there. In its place is ordinary compacted soil. He writes, I considered that I had been mistaken, that what I struck was some unusually dense layer of clay hardened by frost. I have since struck clay hardened by frost many times. It does not ring like iron, and it does not disappear. Over the following 2 years, Crane makes 12 more documented visits to the ridge. The record he keeps becomes increasingly methodical. He begins marking not just the location of the stones, but the precise configuration of surrounding landmarks, particular trees, rock outcroppings, the angle of a creek bend to the northeast. He is building a baseline, a record of the normal, so that abnormalities can be precisely identified and not attributed to faulty memory. In the spring of 1884, he makes an observation that sits at the center of everything that follows. He is sitting at roughly 40 yards from the main foundation when he notices movement at the edge of the stone structure. Peripheral at first, the kind of movement you catch and then dismiss as a bird or a trick of wind. But he held his gaze on the spot, and the movement ceased. He waited, looked away toward the creek, looked back, and in the moment between looking away and looking back, something had changed. A stone block he had been using as a visual reference, one he had specifically noted because of a distinctive iron-stained streak across its face, was in a different position, not dramatically. A foot, perhaps 2, but different. He walked to it and confirmed it with his tape measure against the surrounding landmarks. The stone had moved. He camped at the site that night, sitting with his back against a tree, watching. Nothing moved while he watched. He dozed once briefly in the small hours. When he startled awake, 2 more stones had shifted. He writes, "I have now established to my own satisfaction that these stones do not move when they are observed directly. They move in the intervals, in the moments of inattention. When I slept, they moved. I conducted an experiment. I sat facing the site for a period I estimated at 2 hours without once breaking my gaze. At the end of that period, nothing had changed. I then turned away and counted to 10. When I turned back, a stone I had been watching had rotated approximately a quarter turn on its axis. This is not wind. This is not frost heave. This is not any natural process I am aware of." He goes on, "I do not believe these stones are alive, but I believe something beneath them is, and I believe it is aware of being watched. It stops when it knows it is seen." This is where the Tartaria researchers, who have studied Crane's journal, start to draw connections that can, on first read, seem like a leap. But the logic is not without foundation. One of the recurring observations in Tartaria research is about architecture that responds to its environment in ways conventional materials, science cannot explain. Foundations that seem to go deeper than they should, down into layers that don't match the geological record. Army Corps of Engineers survey reports from the 1870s and 1880s mention in dry bureaucratic language encountering anomalous subsurface formations during preliminary excavation work in the Appalachian and Ozark regions. The reports note the formations, flag them for further study, and then further study never comes. The formations are paved over, built on, forgotten. Cross-referencing those core reports with county history records, the Sorrow Ridge area appears 3 times and 1,878 survey notes. peculiar density readings inconsistent with known local geology. An 80, 70, 881 Township Assessor Report mentions an area on the northern face of the ridge where soil borings could not be completed due to refusal at anomalous depth. And a letter from a federal land agent in 1886 recommends the parcel be classified as unsuitable for homesteading due to ground conditions not conducive to standard agricultural or residential development. The letter does not specify what those conditions are. The parcel was never homesteaded. It is currently designated as part of a state forest with no recorded archaeological surveys on file. Crane's journal entries become more fragmented after 1884. His visits to the ridge continue, but grow less frequent and more cautious. He develops protocols that look almost ritualistic, but are deeply practical, never approaching from the same direction twice, keeping a separate journal just for Sorrow Ridge. And sometime in 1885, he begins documenting what he calls the secondary evidence. The first is a system of shallow channels carved into the bedrock on the western slope, about 300 wide from the main foundation. The channels are arranged in a radial pattern, extending outward from a central point. Too precise to be natural, too consistent in depth and width to be erosion, and they run in a direction not aligned with any natural drainage pattern of the hillside. They run uphill slightly, but measurably as though designed to move something against gravity. The second is what he calls the compass problem. His compass, reliable in that territory for years, begins to behave inconsistently within about a 4 mile of the foundation. A degree or two of variation that compounds over distance into significant navigational error. He compensates by carrying a second compass and comparing readings. The differential varies. It is larger on the days when the stones have moved. The third is something he documents only once and never mentions again. In autumn of 1887, Crane visits the site and finds a section of foundational stone that was not there on his previous visit 6 weeks earlier. Not a stone that moved, a new section extending the visible perimeter of the foundation by approximately 8 feet to the north. The stones are identical in material and cutting style to the ones he has been documenting for 5 years. They are not fresh. They are weathered, lichen-covered, exactly as old-looking as the stones that have been exposed since he first found the site. He writes, "Either these stones were here, and I failed to note them for 5 years, which I do not believe, or they have come up from below. I have found no excavated material, no disturbed earth at their margins. They appear simply to have emerged as though the structure below is still assembling itself or reassembling." He pauses in the journal entry. There is a space of blank lines. Then he writes very quietly in smaller script, "I am no longer certain that what is below this ridge is entirely dead. The question the Tartaria research community keeps returning to is not simply what this civilization was. It is how it persisted, because the reset theory raises an immediate problem. You can erase records. You can demolish structures. You can rename places and rewrite maps, but you cannot easily destroy the underground. And if the civilization that supposedly didn't exist was sophisticated enough to build the structures that are clearly there, the foundations, the hydraulic systems, the electromagnetic anomalies, the subsurface materials that ring like iron, and then vanish, then it was sophisticated enough to put things underground where they would not easily be found. Some of those things may not have been entirely inert when they went in. There are sites scattered across the American landscape and documented in the margins of historical records that were never meant to be read together, where the ground behaves as though it has memory, where the anomalies cluster in patterns too consistent to be coincidental. And in more than one oral tradition connected to this landscape, places like this are described not as haunted and not as simply sacred. They are described as active, still running, still doing something set in motion long ago that has never stopped. Crane arrived at that understanding through observation rather than theory. He did not have the vocabulary for what he was seeing, but he had the honesty to record what he saw, and what he saw was a structure that moved only in the dark spaces of attention, in the blinks, in the turned backs, in the sereners of consciousness, that even the most vigilant person cannot permanently avoid. It was not hiding from him specifically. It was hiding from all observation, moving in the intervals that human perception cannot close. His journal ends in 1896, the year he retired from active fieldwork. The last substantial entry about Sorrow Ridge is dated May of that year. He had made what he believed would be his final visit, updated his maps, taken his measurements, and sat for a long time looking at the stones before writing what amounts to the closest thing in the journal to a conclusion. He writes, "I have spent 14 years trying to determine the nature of what is buried here. I have not determined it. I have determined only this: it is not random. The movements follow a logic I cannot fully decode, but can partially feel like a very slow mechanism. A clock perhaps operating on a time scale that makes human patience seem brief. I believe the surface behaviors, the moving stones, the compass variation, the channels on the hillside are expressions of something much larger operating below. What I have been watching for 14 years is the outermost surface, the skin of something whose depth I cannot estimate," he adds. "I do not think it is dangerous in the sense that it does not appear to have any interest in me. But the condition of not being seen is essential to its operation. I think observation disrupts it. This may be why so little evidence survives. Not because it was destroyed, because it completes its processes in the moments we are not looking, because the reset, if that is what happened, did not end. It is still occurring slowly in every blink. The last line of the entry is not about the sight. He writes, I have not slept with my eyes fully closed in 3 years. My wife asked me why. I tell her, it is an old habit from the mountains. The truth is simpler. On Sorrow Ridge, you learn not to blink, and some lessons the body does not unlearn. There are people today who have visited what is believed to be the approximate location of the crane site. The exact coordinates are not in the journal, but his maps are detailed enough that several researchers have triangulated a probable location within a small area of the state forest. What they have found is consistent with what Crane described. Sections of workstone partially buried in root systems with a precision of fit inconsistent with colonial-era construction. Compass anomalies of 2 to 4 degrees increasing as you approach the central area. One researcher, a woman who asked not to be named, reported sitting at the site and experiencing a persistent sense that things were different when she looked back than when she had looked away. She could not photograph it, but she sat with a hand-drawn grid and marked the position of 3 stones at regular intervals. And at the end of 2 hours, she had a record of movements she could not explain. She did not return, but before she left, she noticed something on the main foundation section, not in Crane's journal. Possibly because the structure has continued its slow process of emergence in the century since he last visited. On the northern face of the largest exposed block, partially obscured by lichen, there is a carved symbol, a circle divided by a horizontal line, with a smaller circle in the upper half. It appears in Tartarian architectural documentation. It appears in the decorative stonework of buildings in Central Asia, dated to the 12th and 13th centuries. It appears on objects recovered from burial sites across Eastern Europe, and the Caucasus that predate those buildings by centuries. It is not a symbol that belongs on a stone in the Appalachian Mountains. It is not a symbol that should be there, but it is there in the lichen on the ridge where an old trapper stopped blinking, where the stones move in the intervals, where something below the surface has been running a process, slow and patient and indifferent to observation, for longer than anyone, with a conventional understanding of American history, is prepared to accept. The ridge does not care whether you accept it. The mechanism does not require your belief to continue. It only requires, as it always has, that eventually, inevitably, unavoidably, you blink.